This is the Living Vertizontal podcast, brought to you by the Church at Riverstone, a fellowship of the Church of the Nazarene in Madera, California. Today's episode focuses on the parables of the mustard seed and the yeast, found in Matthew 13, 31-35. Together, we will be discussing the role of the church in participating in the expansion of the kingdom of heaven.
Hi, I'm Nick.
I'm Natasha.
I'm Brittany.
And I'm Derek.
And we are the Living Vertizontal podcast, back with you guys. Last week, we addressed the parable of the weeds. And this week, we're going to be jumping back just a little bit to in between the telling of the parable of the weeds and the explanation of the parable of the weeds to the parables of the mustard seed in Matthew 13, 31 through 35. And so if you have your Bibles, turn there to follow along. If not, listen up, because we're going to have Brittany go ahead and read that for us.
The parables of the mustard seed and the yeast. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that birds come and perch in its branches. He told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowds in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world.
All right. Thank you for that, Brittany. So there's the parables, pretty short and sweet. So without further ado, let's jump in. What are some observations or questions or things that we might be taking from these parables today?
So I think one of the first things that jumps out to me is his use of the mustard seed, which Jesus in other places and here in Scripture uses as kind of this super small thing that starts out. And when I think about the context of him sharing this, he's kind of beginning the kingdom of heaven with just these disciples who, were other tradesmen. They weren't, the best and the brightest. And so he's beginning with the kingdom of heaven itself is beginning from very, very humble origins. And so I think, that gives us hope, when we look around and we feel like, well, who am I? I'm one. What difference can I make? But this is exactly what Jesus intended for the kingdom of heaven, to come from the places that are least expected and then to grow into this large place, or in this case, this large tree, large shrub, to represent the kingdom of heaven.
So when we talked about this yesterday, I looked up kind of the characteristics of a mustard seed to kind of see if there was anything there. And one thing that I saw, that mustard seeds like to grow in wet environments. So they like the moisture. And, we know that Jesus is the living water. So I think, intentional or non-intentional, I'm going to say intentional, that the mustard seed grows in wet conditions, and Jesus is living water that we're going to grow if we are close to him and we stay rooted in soil that he has moved in. So that's what I got from the mustard seed.
It's also a fairly invasive plant. So when we look out, I don't know, here in California, we look out, like when you're driving down the highway, you can see those yellow flowers kind of littering the fields as you drive by, and it just continues to grow and kind of take over whatever is there. We were talking about with the kids yesterday, if you were to drop some in your backyard, your parents probably wouldn't be very happy because, it's, if you're not harvesting mustard, it's going to be like a weed. And so it's going to kind of grow and take over your grass and your planters and all of that. So, it's good to be part of a growing kingdom that's invasive, I guess, as it remains connected to its source of life, which is living water.
I think the thing that stuck out to me as a result of conversation from yesterday, but also just in reading it. I know the way we've been talking about the mustard seed is as a shrub. But the words that are used here in the passage is that when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, which maybe is a little bit of an overstatement, but I think the words that follow that are maybe why that statement is so important, and that is becomes a tree so that the birds come and perch in its branches. And I think for me that really sticks out because I guess, hold on, pause that conversation and let's remember that this thing that we're talking about right now, these parables that we're talking about, we are talking about what it looks like to live in the kingdom of heaven, right? Not what the kingdom of heaven is going to look like when we get to eternity necessarily, but what it actually looks like here and now among us. Jump back into that conversation I was having now and recognizing that when we are living in the kingdom of heaven is a place where where birds can find safety, where they can settle down, where they can feel secure, which is very counter to the world that we live in today because it doesn't take very much looking around to feel unsettled, insecure, unsafe. And yet the kingdom of heaven contradicts that. It is a place of safety. It is a place where the birds can settle in and take up residence. And I mean, the use of birds in itself is interesting.
So it's interesting that you pointed out about the birds perching in the bush or the tree, because at our table, Brittany had discussed how, the birds were our enemy, so to speak, earlier in the passage, earlier in chapter 13, and the very thing that came to destroy us, now we help to continue its life. We give it a place, not that we give it peace, but it can come and find peace in relationship with us, the very thing that came to destroy us. And so it's this whole counter idea of this upside down kingdom, which we had heard that discussed on Sunday as well. And so it's very counter to the kingdoms that have been established on earth. Instead of, trying to exact revenge on something that tried to destroy us, we are turning the other cheek. And we are like that living water, so to speak, by being the hands and feet of Jesus. And so we come from, it's just a very counter idea. It's an upside down kingdom. And instead of trying to take life, we're trying to live in the manner that Jesus did and give life. And so as the kingdom grows, as we grow, we offer refuge, or we should be offering refuge for the very thing that tried to destroy us before.
And I think, while the connection that's made is one where we look at it and go, well, he talks about birds here in verse 32. He also talked about birds back in like verse 4 of chapter 13, and just say there must be a relation. I think we can even go further and say, just by even looking at the parable we addressed last week and this reality of the coexistence of wheat and weeds together and the responsibility that the wheat has to remain rooted. And
we should expect that there will be weeds in our kingdom. So there will be the birds that are plucking up the seed in our kingdom.
He just builds. It's just like in the Sermon on the Mount, where he continues to build and build and build. Like, it's a journey. We don't stop. Like, if the growing stops, something is wrong, because there's like, we're never going to get it all right. And so it's just this continual reminder that there is still more work to do. In this kingdom, you never stop growing. And I mean, that's in fields, like, farmers hope that they never see growing stop. Otherwise, that means the end of their livelihood. And it doesn't mean the end of our livelihood, but if we stop growing, maybe there's something wrong in our soil, and we need to go back to the farmer and say, like, do you need to till me? Do I have rock or something going on? So it's like, it's just a building. And I think we've seen that throughout Matthew.
And I guess when we think about mustard seed and mustard plants, as you were talking about it, Natasha, in the backyard, or like if you planted this in the backyard, your parents would probably not be happy unless you were actually trying to
Grow mustard.
harvest mustard, I think. But this idea that, you know, the mustard seed, the plant, it's not, it is us as individuals, but it's also more than that. It's us as a people of God, and the expansion of the kingdom. It's individual and collective. It's one and all. It's just, I don't know. It's the church, right? It's goes back to this conversation on the church and the role of the individual in the midst of the whole of the kingdom of heaven, and being a place of safety and refuge for all who may come.
So last week we were supposed to live among them, and now we are supposed to, help be a place of refuge and peace for the very weed that may have been trying to choke us out.
And so now you bring in Jeremiah, right? This idea of the people in exile are not just supposed to exist or survive, but they are actually supposed to work towards the thriving of their captors.
Well, and we know this, right? Because Jesus talks about how the kingdom is here, right? It's come now, and everyone living in the kingdom is a citizen of heaven. They just may not be submitted to the king. And so even like we talk about the birds being, a part of being enemies of the king, and yet still resting in, his peace and his presence, but still refusing to participate in what the kingdom's activities are.
Well, that leads a good segue into the yeast.
I think so.
And how yeast completely changes flour. It completely changes the molecular makeup of flour and produces this reaction that causes it to rise. And you have to think that if we're the yeast and we're living among the flour, I think about work. And at work, I don't know how many people are believers. But if I'm the yeast and I continually have that thankful, that grateful attitude, I have that kingdom mindset, the people around me are going to change. It's going to mix into, even if it's 60 pounds, because 60 pounds is a lot of flour. Even if it's 60 pounds of flour, the flour doesn't get a choice if they change. I mean, Jesus is contagious. The joy that comes from knowing him is contagious.
Yeah. And I think as the yeast, you have to be willing to be mixed into.
Absolutely.
And so that kind of comes back full circle to this conversation that we were having last week, and being the wheat and choosing not to uproot ourselves and take on the role of the farmer, but allowing him to knead us into the wheat that exists, or into the flour. Sorry, I'm getting all my ingredients confused. But to be kneaded into the flour so that we can be used by him to transform the kingdom.
If you think about it in the context of, and I don't know why I used 60 pounds, but there's 12 disciples, right? So that's like 5 weeds for every wheat, so to speak, mixed in this idea. So it takes way less yeast to affect flour. And so like we don't have to feel like we're like this superhuman because he did it with 12. If he can do it with 12, like he can do it with 4 or 8 or 1. Like, so he can affect great change if we have the heart of living among the weeds, being different, being like living this upside down kingdom. I love how he says like the kingdom of heaven is. He explains it in a way like that they can put context behind. Like this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. It's like a mustard seed, like you alluded to earlier about they're very agricultural minded. Like he puts it in context where they can understand. And so I just think it's funny that whole 60, and I think about the 12 and how the math works out perfectly. Like what's 12 times 5 is 60, right? So I just think that's ironic to me that he used the 60. But regardless, it's maybe that's another way God just works everything out, because the math works out perfect. 12, 5, 60. So it doesn't take as much yeast to affect the flour. And I think that's a great thing. Like the kingdom of heaven it may start small, but a little bit can affect a great amount. If we choose every day to live into that, being a wheat among the weeds, or being different, or living that upside down life.
And I mean, maybe I'm stepping into something that I shouldn't, but I guess the thought that went through my head, you kept saying it only takes a little bit of yeast to affect much more flour. And then I thought in my head, well, but what would happen to that flour? And maybe one of you know who bakes some, but what would happen to flour if instead of just a little bit of yeast, you actually like over yeasted the flour?
It would go big. Like it would come out of the oven.
Would it ruin the bread, or would the bread still taste right?
I don't think so.
Are we looking at 30, 60, 100
Because if you
times?
think,
That's what came to my mind.
if you think like, so it creates a chemical reaction. What that chemical reaction is carbon dioxide.
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine that tastes very good. Like an excess amount of something trapped in there.
I guess the reason why I asked that is because I'm sitting here thinking, and I think the implications continue to point us into this reality that while there can be benefit gained from coming together as the people of God, we got to be very careful only existing in places as just the people of God, like a holy huddle is what I've heard it called before. We got to be very careful just being this overbearing amount of yeast, because we've been called to be that meager beginning in the midst of the world around us.
So kind of going back to your question, so I'm thinking about this like an enzyme reaction, right? And so one of the products is carbon dioxide, but the substrate, right, is provided by the flour, which is what's getting broken down by the yeast.
Can you, for those
The
of us who have no
carbohydrates.
idea what you're talking about, what's a
The sugar.
substrate?
So the flour is providing is what's getting kind of eaten up by the yeast to produce the carbon dioxide.
The carbohydrates, the energy source.
Okay.
Yeah. So so essentially you're left, if you have too much yeast packed into or even if you don't mix it well, right? Then you're left with this over concentration in an area like you were talking about, but then you've lost potential. And so that's kind of what struck me as you were saying this is as the yeast, right? As the thing that's supposed to be the catalyst, right? That's supposed to cause change, that's supposed to make things happen for the kingdom, on behalf of the kingdom, in partnership with Christ. I'm not actually living up to my full potential because I'm not surrounding myself with enough. I use substrate, carbohydrates. Okay, I'm not surrounding myself with enough of the flour to actually make optimal change.
Preach.
And so again, it is a continuation of that conversation that was started last week, where, like, man, we have a responsibility, not just we don't just have the benefit of saying I exist in the kingdom of heaven, and that's great. Like that's not where that's the purpose of our life is not to just exist in that reality that we exist in the kingdom of heaven and we're all good. Like the purpose of existing in the kingdom of heaven is to continue to expand the kingdom of heaven and bring more in, surround ourselves with more flowers. So that way we can actually, God through us can make that change that he literally died to make all those years ago.
Well, I think last week, didn't you, Derek, did you say something about how do we change the weeds into wheat?
I did say something to that effect.
This is exactly how you do it. I mean, it has to be the perfect recipe. It has to be exactly what, God is calling, or it's not going to work, or it's not, or like you said, it's going to lose potential. Or if you don't put enough yeast in, it's not going to rise enough, and it's not going to get that reaction's not going to happen enough to make any difference. So I think that's how God can change the weeds into wheat.
You're looking for the perfect spirit-led recipe.
And that's why it's important to live vertically.
I was going to say, this comes back to this again. This is why it's so important for us to make sure that we are listening to what God is saying to us and then living that out and paying attention to what is going on in front of us and listening to what is going on around us, taking that to God, saying, all right, God, what am I supposed to do? Because I'm not a baker and I don't know what the right ingredients are. But as I surrender to him and submit to his leadership and his lordship in my life, in every situation, and allow him to speak into those, we start to have this winning combination.
I think when we I may have talked about this last week about being comfortable. And so if we're comfortable in our circle of believers, kind of like we've kind of alluded to, I think we miss out, or we can miss out on that potential. It we aren't mixing all the ingredients, because it's easy to stay together in a nucleus of our body. But we talked about being uncomfortable in certain places that it's outside of our what is normal to us. So going to places and hanging out with people that we wouldn't normally do. And so I just think it's amazing how these conversations seem to come back to the same things every time. Growth takes stretching. If you want a pizza to look like if you want dough to be shaped like a pizza, there's stretching involved. You have to go out of what's comfortable or normal, because I don't know, when you mix it in the mixer, it's kind of in a ball. And so you have to let it rise and do what it does to get it to do exactly. And so, yeah, it takes the right ingredients in the right circumstances in the right hands to see growth take place, or to see that 30, 60, or 100. So I just think what Jesus has done and what Matthew has recorded is just, I just love how it's building and building and building to this, never getting comfortable. There's so much more if we keep reaching for more, or keep reaching for Jesus. There's more.
Yeah.
Well, working through all the dough, kneading it's hard work.
Unless you have a KitchenAid. Gets better.
True.
So are you saying Jesus is like a
KitchenAid
divine
mixer.
KitchenAid?
Yeah,
But that KitchenAid mixer
commercial
works
style.
real hard.
it does. Good point.
I'm just that's uncomfortable. That takes effort, and sometimes being the yeast, it takes effort.
I think about that. And I think for us in this room, we're all we've grown up in the church. We have kind of a different story than some people. I mean, newer Christians, they probably have a host of just by default, a host of non-Christian acquaintances or friends. And I think for us, sometimes, and I don't know, and I imagine this gets harder as you get older and you kind of start to develop your little circles of friends, and you have your people. And if you're not constantly on the move or having to make changes in your life or changing, careers, or you get this group of people, and probably over time you start to all look a lot alike, and that's great, because hopefully you're being you started out as the yeast, and so you transform that whole group. But then now you're all yeast, and you're gathered in this place. And so I feel like it's very easy to just sit and coast. It's much harder to be looking intentionally. Man, I don't have enough. I can't list 15 people who I'm trying to affect. I can't list 15 weeds or 15, handfuls of flour. I can't do that. And so I'm going to partner up with a buddy and we're going to go find who are these 15 people and I'm going to go make friends, or I'm going to go hang out in a coffee shop, or I'm going to go sit at the local parks and I'm going to make friends who don't yet know Jesus. And I'm going to be that change agent in their lives to help build the kingdom of heaven. That is uncomfortable and that is hard work. And I don't think it's the norm for Christians.
And I think it also originates, again, going back to this vertizonal conversation, it all originates with a life that is willing to be submitted to Jesus and his needing and his work and his call in your life. I mean, Matthew 28 is pretty clear. Jesus says, go and make disciples. So we don't have this option of, we don't have to go to the park and meet people, or we don't have to try to find the unsaved people around us. No, that's actually part of our job as Christians. And so this life that walks in that direction is a life of obedience. It is a life that is submitted to the King, living in the kingdom.
And I don't think that we can just walk through life and walk by acquaintances and expect that without having any conversations or minimal conversations and think that that is going to be enough. If we're not taking the time to invest in people, and I know that that's not everything's not about relationships. I know that Jesus is far bigger than that. We've seen where he's done things and no one was involved. I think of Paul and what he did with Paul. However, in that call to make disciples, it's work. It's like the kneading of the dough. There is work involved. So I can't just expect that I walk through life and that is going to be enough. And I say that to myself more than anyone else, because I don't know if I could write 15 down. I could write a few, but I'm guilty of not being as intentional as I should be about making time for people. Jesus made time for people, and what did it do? Changed their lives. He made time for people, and didn't do it in he just had conversations with people. Whether it's I think of the woman of the well, that's a great example. Conversations changed a life. That's all he did. He talked to her. And so I just think we can't expect that we can just walk through life and say, well, I'm living differently and that's enough. Or I've said hi and I've been kind and that's enough. There's more to this call to go and make disciples than just what's on the surface. I think it requires going deeper. And so I don't know. I think it is far more than I'm not going to say that it's just me, but I think there are more people who could say that it's far more than just what we've made it out to be. I think there are many in the church could say that it's far more. I mean, I've even heard someone say that it's not their job, that it's up to the pastor to go and make disciples. And if that's the way we think, we've missed it. Mm-hmm. We're not excluded from that, whoever you are. That wasn't just those are followers. They weren't called pastors. They were disciples. Disciples are followers. They were followers of Jesus. If we want to be a Christian, we're a follower of Jesus. So part of that following is going and making disciples. If we've absolved ourselves because we don't have a title, we're guilty anyway. I don't want it to sound harsh. That's not the intent. But that's the reality. That is the reality. No one is absolved from that. So, I think that was a God call out or a good call out. And I think we have to take that into account every day, that it takes more than just, waving a hand and being a friendly neighbor.
Jesus set a really good example for this, right? With how to make disciples. He spent large amounts of time talking to the crowds, but most of his time was spent with just a handful of people that he was doing life with, coaching them, and then would send them out and then say, okay, come on back. how'd it go? We check in, right? And then he'd give them a couple tips, ask them some questions, and, send them out again. And this is kind of like this living life together process that is required in what you're saying. It goes beyond just saying, hey, how's it going, once a week or less, depending on where we're at.
And in that, he gave him a chance to fail, like to get it wrong. Like he wasn't overlording and saying, like you need to do this, 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 and this. He gave them a task. They went out. If they got it wrong, he was good about telling them. But, I think there's just, like you said, there's just so much more to it than.
Well, and I think even in this chapter alone, you see that modeled, right? I mean, in chapter 13, he's speaking to masses, but then he's explaining the parables to his disciples on two different occasions. He separates from this like ministry of proclamation, separates from that to just have this ministry of discipleship with his disciples, where he is explaining and helping kind of pull the lid off of the conversation that he is trying to have. I think the thing, kind of the last piece of this passage, which also, in my mind, it kind of goes in with what you were saying, Derek, about, it's not just this wave, but there is this doing life. There is this, I guess what I was hearing in my head is there's this conversation that must exist between us and the other. Yes, God is God and he can do the miraculous like Paul, but there's a lot more instances of where transformation takes place in the midst of conversation, in the midst of relationship. And so the closing of this parable is this statement where it says, Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables, right? And he did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. And previously, we've had this conversation on why Jesus spoke in parables. I mean, he addresses it earlier in Matthew 13. But then this is actually not even a statement that Jesus is making. This is not red letters. If you have a red letter Bible, these are black letters, which mean that this is a commentary that the writer of Matthew is inserting. And the commentary that he says is, so was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. And if you're reading that, that is actually a direct quote from Psalm 78, verse 2. And if you read Psalm 78, which I'm going to take a moment and just read the first few verses of it, maybe this begins to reveal to us another facet of why Jesus was speaking in parables. And I think it kind of goes along with what you were saying in this, like, the responsibility that we have in the relationship with others. And so this Psalm 78 is actually from Asaph. And it says, my people hear my teaching. Listen to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth with a parable. I will utter hidden things from of old. Things we have heard and known, things our ancestors have told us. We will not hide them from their descendants. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power and the wonders he has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach their children, so the next generation would know them, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn would tell their children. Then they would put their trust in God and would not forget his deeds, but would keep his commands. And this passage goes on for a number of more verses, and the verses that ensue are a retelling of the story of Israel up to that point, of their wilderness wanderings, of their overcoming and conquering in the promised land, of their deliverance from Egypt and the oppression that was seen there. And it's this story that Asaph is telling, and as he tells the story, he is telling the story because he is saying it is this story that is going to bring back the generations to come to faithfulness to God, to obedience to God. And so I can't help but think that maybe a piece of why Jesus is talking in parables is for the sake of telling the story, right? Of bringing the people back. And there has been this tension that has existed between the religious elites, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the people that Jesus was often found in ministry with, like eating with, which is like the down and outs and the lowest of the lows. There's been this tension that has existed. And I can't help but believe that the ones that were hearing these stories and actually hearing, right? Whoever has ears, let them hear, like we talked about last week. The ones that have ears and were hearing were the ones that were the down and outs, because they were hearing these stories, they were making these connections and realizing, oh my goodness, this is the Messiah. This is the one who we've heard tales about. And so it's the story that Jesus is telling through these parables that is awakening the hearts of people and bringing them back to him. And so when I think about that with us today, yes, again, God is God and he can do things. He can transform a life without an encounter from anybody else. But we are also the hands and feet of God. And we have this responsibility to tell the story of what God has done and of his faithfulness and of his loving kindness and of his sacrifice and what it has done in our lives, and then show what it has done in our lives. So that way, as we live that story, the hearts of the weeds can be awakened and transformation can take place. The yeast can take hold in the life of the flour and delicious bread comes forth.
I think if we put it in the context of the harvest with like the soil, the 30, 60, or 100, like by telling those who come behind us, by making those connections with the people we encounter on a daily life, by doing what Jesus called us to do, that's how we can see the 30, the 60, the 100. Not that we do it. Like the stories are the stories that God gave us, but they're not our stories. And so like when we share them, I get overwhelmed because I recognize like I couldn't have done these things on my own. Like I'm not that good. Like these stories that you've given me, Jesus, like I can't recreate. I couldn't even write a story that good. Like I just couldn't. And so, you know, we have to be sharing them if we want to see the weeds changed. If we want to see the weeds become wheat, if we want to see our enemy be able to be sustained by us, we have to tell those stories. If we go from the bird who was trying to destroy us to the bird that we're helping to see thrive and live. And so tell the story. It's good. Like Jesus is good. What he's done is good. Like you are good, Jesus. I'm not going to even act like you're not here because you are. So Jesus, you are good. And so, you know, my charge or challenge to people this week would be tell the story. And if there's nobody to tell the story to, find the person, like make the time, find the person, start to connect so that you can tell them the story.
So we've got two essentially marching orders from these two parables today, right? Identify the people in your life that are the flour and be prepared to tell the story of what God has done. And if we can't identify somebody, well, then we better find somebody. And we have got to be ready to tell the story of what God is doing. Not just what he did, you know, decades ago, maybe for some of us when we first accepted him as Lord and Savior of our life, but what he is doing actively, how he is currently working.
Be sure to follow the Living Vertizontal podcast to stay current on all our new releases. To learn more about the Church at Riverstone, visit us at thechurchatriverstone.org.